The full set list for Mask of Change is here, meaning we now have the full list of cards we will be receiving in the next mainline set, Twilight Masquerade. I've already done a video talking about cards from Crimson Haze, as well as some videos talking about standalone cards or sets of cards from both sets. So in this video, we will be taking a look at some of the noteworthy cards we should be on the lookout for, and what cards we can expect to see pop up in decks once we receive Twilight Masquerade later on at the end of May. If you didn't see a certain card, then I either talked about it in a previous video, or I have plans to make a separate video about them, or I personally thought it just wasn't worth talking about. Feel free to let me know in the comments what your thoughts are about some of these cards, and any that I might have missed. Without further ado, let's begin. Starting off with the duo Volbeat and Illumise. Both Pokemon have a very strong attack depending on if you go first or if you go second, and they only cost a single colourless energy. Volbeat's attack reads, if you go first, you can use this attack during your first turn. Search your deck for up to 2 basic Pokemon and put them onto your bench. A very strong setup enabler that ignores the restrictions of not being allowed to attack if you go first, letting you grab any 2 basic Pokemon from your deck, including rulebox Pokemon like Radiance, Vs and EXs, helping you set up your board more efficiently, and in some cases can fix a bricky hand or a slow start. However, the counterpart Illumise reads, you can use this attack only if you go second and only during your first turn. Shuffle one of your opponent's benched Pokemon and all cards attached to it into the deck. The complete opposite of Volbeat, instead of helping you set up your board, this card helps you disrupt your opponent's board, shuffling back any of their benched Pokemon as well as everything attached. However, there is a downside, that being you can only use it if you go second and only during your first turn. Even then, the effect is still strong and can push your opponent back quite a bit depending on what you send back. Now they have to find it or use cards to get that Pokemon back into play if it was an important piece of their setup. Both Pokemon are strong in their own way and could see potential play depending on the deck. Next up is Chandelier, boasting a very strong double-edged sword ability that reads, once during your turn you may use this ability. Each player draws a card. Giving yourself an additional card to play with is a very strong ability, but also giving one to your opponent seems a bit counterintuitive. However, its ability pairs very well with its attack. For a single fire energy, it does 30 damage times the number of cards in your opponent's hand. Pokemon is all about digging through your deck to set up your board. Sometimes you may need to use multiple search and draw cards to find what you need. There will be times where your hand size is gigantic, so Chandelier will be hitting for huge amounts of damage for only a single energy card. However, being on a stage 2 Pokemon, it will take some time to set up. However, if your opponent is oblivious to what the card does, they could be falling right into a devastating trap. Milotic has a very niche but, in the right circumstances, strong ability. It reads, your opponent's Pokemon in play and cards attached to those Pokemon can't be returned to the hand. This may sound pretty useless, however with the abundance of decks using Penny and Professor Turo, Milotic quickly becomes a very strong card. Your opponent can't use those supporters to scoop up their Pokemon out of harm's way, meaning that they are ripe and ready to be knocked out. Plus, against stun and stall decks, they can't constantly scoop up their Pokemon after it takes damage to keep denying you a knockout. A niche card that has its applications depending on the matchup and how the format evolves. Frostlass is another one of these Pokemon with a niche ability that, when played against the right deck, can be incredibly strong. Reading, during Pokemon checkup, put 1 damage counter on each Pokemon in play with an ability, both yours and your opponent's, except any Frostlass. So what this ability basically does is put a hidden poison status on all Pokemon with an ability except Frostlass. This ability is very niche, but that extra damage every turn and on every Pokemon could creep up on your opponent unexpectedly. They suddenly have a lot of damage on their Pokemon and could be in the range of multiple knockouts depending on what your opponent is playing. Radiant Greninja and Greninja EX could knock out 2 EX Pokemon after enough turns. Sableye could threaten a bunch of Pokemon with KOs. It could even help with certain Pokemon that are just shy of hitting the right damage numbers for those higher HP Pokemon. Obviously it won't damage every Pokemon in play, and it also damages your own, but that extra damage could add up over time and prove to be a very intimidating threat to your opponent. Next up is a Pokemon that a lot of people have been hyping up, and I'm going to be honest, I'm very 50-50 on this card. Palafin and Palafin EX. Palafin has the 0 to hero ability, which reads, once during your turn when this Pokemon moves from the active spot to the bench, you may search your deck for Palafin EX and switch it with this Pokemon. Any attached cards, damage counters, special conditions, turns in play, and any other effects remain on the new Pokemon. If you switched a Pokemon in this way, shuffle this card into the deck. And then Palafin EX has the hero's Spirit ability, which reads, put this Pokemon into play only with the effect of Palafin's 0 to hero ability. Already there are various issues with this strategy, the big one being, you can't evolve Palafin EX from the hand. You can only evolve it with the 0 to hero ability. And on top of that, it can only evolve from the deck. So if you have all of your Palafin EX in your hand, then you're going to need to find a way to shuffle them back into the deck. Either with a supporter card or by discarding them and then using something like Super Rod. You also need to switch Palafin from the active to the bench in order to trigger its ability, which isn't hard with the plethora of switching cards we have in the game, and it only has a retreat cost of 1, but against stun and stall decks, you're going to have a bad time. Palafin EX is very strong with 340 HP, and for a single water energy, it can do 250 damage, but it can't attack next turn. The card is good, but the loopholes you have to go through just to get it into play seems a bit much. The fact that you can only evolve it from the deck and can't evolve it from the hand is a major drawback. Depending on how the deck is built, it could see some playing success, but it is going to need a good pilot. Next on the list we have Luxray EX, boasting 2 very powerful attacks. Its first attack for 2 colorless energy does a respectable 120 damage with an added effect. Look at your opponent's hand and discard 1 card you find there. Almost a copy paste of Luxray V having the same energy cost, but dealing lower damage, and you can only discard an item card, while Luxray EX lets you discard any card from your opponent's hand, and does more damage on top of that. Its second attack for 2 lightning does a huge 250 damage, but you have to discard all energy from this Pokemon. To be honest, the second attack, while it is powerful, is not worth using given that the first attack is a lot stronger. You can attach a double turbo energy which will lower your damage down to 100, but you get to look at your opponent's hand and remove any card. Gaining hand knowledge is very powerful as you can gauge what your opponent might do next turn, as well as what cards they have at their disposal. Plus you can remove one of those potential options. A powerful support card, an item card, or even a Pokemon. The choice is yours. The card could very easily replace Luxray V inside stall and stun decks. It will take a turn or two to set up, but when you do, it can easily disrupt and ruin your opponent's potential to win the game. Clefable is a very sneaky threat that players will need to be aware of. For 2 colorless energy, its attack does any attack of your opponent's active Pokemon, completely ignoring energy requirements. You can just use any attack that your opponent's active Pokemon has. If they have a Charizard EX, use Burning Darkness. Giratina V-Star, use Lost Impact. Roaring Moon, use Frenzied Gouging, etc, etc. Mew EX from 151 had the exact same attack, however it costed 3 energy and it was on a 2 prize Pokemon. Granted, Clefable is an evolution Pokemon, but its attack cost is lower and it is able to be fulfilled with a single energy attachment. Plus, it's a 1 prize Pokemon, something to be aware of, so be careful leaving something in the active with a strong enough attack that can KO itself. Alakazam is another sneaky Pokemon that could potentially take a win out of nowhere. Having 2 attacks both costing a single Psychic Energy, let's start with the second attack, which does 10 damage and then an additional 50 damage for each energy attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. Most Pokemon in the format will have a maximum of 2 to 3 energy, so you'll get an extra 100 to 150 damage. Not enough to KO most Pokemon, but with the use of its first attack, you could very easily take multiple knockouts from nowhere. It reads, your opponent's active Pokemon is now confused. Move any number of damage counters from your opponent's Pokemon to their other Pokemon in any way you like. Keep in mind this is damage from any of your opponent's Pokemon, and you can move any number onto anything you want. meaning if you dealt damage all onto one Pokemon, you could move all of that damage onto multiple Pokemon and possibly take multiple knockouts. Or if you've attacked multiple Pokemon, you could move it all onto one Pokemon instead, a strong support Pokemon or one of your opponent's attackers. Or if your opponent has damaged themselves with something like Roaring Moon, you could take that 200 damage and push it somewhere else. The card has its uses and could very easily leave your opponent in a bad position if not dealt with correctly. Mightyena benefits from moving and attacking in packs with its playstyle. For 1 Darkness Energy it does 30 damage, with, as always, an added effect. This attack does 90 more damage for each of your benched Mightyena. Since you can play a maximum of 4 copies, that means 4 Mightyena in play, so you can hit for 300 damage. Granted, there is always the possibility that 1 or 2 may end up in your prize cards, but even if you can get just 1 additional Mightyena in play, that's still 120 damage for a single energy. Plus its second attack for 1 Darkness and 1 Colourless does 60 damage and prevents your opponent's active Pokemon from retreating next turn. And we all know how powerful those types of abilities can be. Scolipede can be a very devastating threat if left unchecked. For 1 Darkness and 1 Colourless, its attack reads, put damage counters on your opponent's active Pokemon until its HP is 10. Pinning an immediate threat onto one of your opponent's Pokemon is very strong, because if they don't heal it enough, or find a way to remove those damage counters, then literally any attack that does 10 damage will KO that Pokemon. Combining this card with something like Brute Bonnet from Paradox Rift could lead to a very devastating combo, using Brute Bonnet to poison both active Pokemon, then using Scolipede to leave your opponent's active on 10 HP, meaning that when your opponent begins their turn, the poison will knock out their active Pokemon. Even its pre-evolution Whirlipede has a very strong stun type attack. 1 Darkness not only poisons the active, but prevents it from retreating as well. A potentially dangerous combo that could bring special conditions back into the metagame. Brute Bonnet is an absolute powerhouse. I previously mentioned this card in my video about Emolga, but the card is just that strong. For 3 Darkness Energy it does 50 damage, and then an additional 50 more for each damage counter on your opponent's active Pokemon. I don't need to explain why this card is amazing. Even if your opponent's active only has 1 or 2 damage counters on it, that's still 100 to 150 damage. This card will definitely find its way into Darkness type decks, plus with it being an Ancient card, it will fit in just perfectly with Roaring Moon and Ancient box. You can soften up something with Baby Moon or Koraidon, then bring in Brute Bonnet to finish the job. A super strong and formidable Pokemon that can KO even the highest of HP Pokemon just from a few damage counters. Definitely a card to be on the lookout for. Next up is Dragapult EX, as well as its previous evolution, Dracloak. Dracloak has an ability that reads, once during your turn you may look at the top 2 cards of your deck, put one of them into your hand, and put the other on the bottom of your deck. Being able to look at the top 2 cards of your deck is very strong, letting you dig into your deck to find any missing pieces. Plus you can use it multiple times if you have multiple copies of that card in play. Comfey has almost the exact same ability, except it has to be in the active spot and you put one of those cards into the Lost Zone instead of the bottom of the deck. But that strategy works in tandem with the Lost Zone, so it isn't necessarily a downside. Dragapult EX doesn't have any ability like its pre-evolution, but it does have 2 attacks. The first attack is just there, but the second attack is where its true power lies. For 1 Fire and 1 Psychic, it does 200 damage and then puts 6 damage counters on your opponent's benched Pokemon in any way you like. Not only does the attack do a huge amount of damage on its own, but then you get to put 6 damage counters on whatever you want. You could put it all onto a low HP Pokemon, maybe spread it around for your attack next turn. Super strong, but it does require 2 different energy types, the standard for Dragon Pokemon, but depending on what deck it's played in and what support cards are utilised, could lead to a very strong deck. Tatsugiri could find its home in every deck, due to its ability being super strong and generic. Reading, once during your turn, if this Pokemon is in the active spot, you may look at the top 6 cards of your deck. Reveal a support card you find there and put it into your hand. We do have Pokegear 3.0 which does the same thing, but it's on an item card. Item cards are pretty hard to recycle and reuse, whereas Pokemon are the opposite. Plus, you can only play a maximum of 4 Pokegear, whereas Tatsugiri, you can use every turn as long as you have it in play. promote it after a Pokemon is knocked out, and dig through your deck for a needed support card. The only issue is its retreat cost is 1, so you will need to attach an energy to retreat it out of the active or use a switch card or something like Jet Energy. Even then, it's still a really good piece of generic consistency for pretty much every deck. And for our final Pokemon before we move on to item and support cards, it's Blissey EX. Its ability reads, once during your turn you may move a basic energy card from one of your Pokemon to another of your Pokemon. This ability has multiple different uses and applications. You could move energy from a Pokemon that's close to being knocked out, that way you don't lose it or have to waste other cards to get it back. You could move energy onto a different Pokemon so you can use that one's attack instead of the other Pokemon's. You could move energy onto something in active to retreat it if needed so on and so forth. It also has a pretty good attack itself. For 3 colourless energy it does 180 damage, then you can draw until you have 6 cards in your hand. Decent damage, and you get to refill your hand for next turn, plus this thing has 300 HP on a stage 1 Pokemon. Slap a Hero's Cape on it and that's 400 HP. It does have a hefty 4 retreat cost, but that just means you could use something like Heavy Baton, so when it gets knocked out, any energy on it can be moved to other Pokemon. Something that could slide its way into certain decks is a very strong tank that can hit hard and move energy if needed. Finally, moving on to the item and support cards, starting with Waking Whistle, which reads, look at the top 5 cards of your opponent's deck. Put any number of basic Pokemon you find there onto your opponent's bench. More support for stun decks. This card is really good, letting you force certain Pokemon onto your opponent's bench for either stalling out the game if it's something that they can't use the attack of or they can't retreat, or you could put some basic Pokemon down to easily knock out and take a few prize cards, maybe even bench an EX to knock out as well. A very versatile card that will mostly see you play in stun and control decks. Handy Fan is another disruptive type of card that reads, whenever the active Pokemon this card is attached to takes damage from an opponent's attack, move an energy from the attacking Pokemon to one of your opponent's benched Pokemon. This card is literally Clorf EX but on a tool card. Very disruptive and annoying, a card that will deter your opponent from wanting to attack since they can move an energy onto something else, and depending on the deck that can be very annoying as you may need that energy type on a certain Pokemon if you're playing different types. Something to keep an eye on. And our final card of this video is Jamming Tower, which reads, Pokemon tools attached to Pokemon in play, both yours and your opponent's, have no effect. Given the abundance of decks in the format that use tool cards, this card is pretty useful, shutting off powerful effects from cards such as the Energy Boosters, Hero's Cape, Maximum Belt, Bravery Charm, the card we just looked at, and any other tool cards we may see pop up in the format. This card could be a decent tech inclusion for some decks. It does shut off tool cards for both players, so make sure you remove it from the field before using your own if you decide to play in it. Not quite as strong as other stadium cards, but against certain decks that rely a lot on their tool cards, this could be a very powerful inclusion for your deck. Overall, Twilight Masquerade is looking like a strong set. Lots of new tools, support, and possible new decks altogether could arise from these new cards. The current best decks will probably stay relatively the same but with a few modifications if any of them can utilise these new cards. I don't think this set will be as strong or as impactful to the game as Temporal Forces was. After all, it was the first set of the new year and the first set of the new rotation. Twilight Masquerade will have its impact on the meta, as there are some very good cards in here, but what decks and strategies will use those cards, we'll just have to wait and see. At the time of this video's release, the set has just dropped over in Japan, but we will have to wait another month till we can get our hands on these new cards. Regardless to say, I am very excited to see how the Pokemon trading card game develops over the next few weeks, as players over in Japan start to tinker around with this new set.